Sometime around the year 850 AD, a brass vessel in Baghdad poured water into a basin with no human hand touching it. The device sensed its own water level and responded accordingly. A feedback mechanism built 11 centuries before the word automation existed. Three brothers designed it, described it precisely, and moved on to harder problems. Their names were Ahmad, Muhammad, and Al-Hassan, sons of Musa ibn Shakir, and almost nobody outside specialist libraries has heard of them. This video is about what they actually built, why it mattered, and how an entire civilization's scientific genius came close to vanishing from the story we tell ourselves about human invention. The question worth holding is this: if their machines worked, and modern engineers have confirmed that many did, what else did we lose when we stopped telling this story? To understand the Banu Musa brothers, you first have to understand the city they lived in. Baghdad in the 9th century was not merely a large city. It was the largest city on earth, home to perhaps 1 million people at its height, with hospitals, observatories, paper mills, and a postal system that functioned across 3 continents. The Abbasid Caliph al-Mansur had founded it in 762 AD on a circular plan, and within 2 generations it had become the intellectual center of the known world. Scholars arrived from Persia, India, Greece, and Central Asia. They brought manuscripts, instruments, and problems. The city absorbed them all. At the heart of this activity stood an institution the Arabs called Bayt al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom. It was more than a library. It was a funded, organized program of translation and original research, state-sponsored science on a scale that would not be seen again in Europe until the 17th century. Under Caliph Harun al-Rashid, and then his son al-Mamun, translators worked in teams, converting Greek, Sanskrit, and Syriac texts into Arabic. Not merely preserving them, but questioning them, extending them, arguing with them in the margins. It was into this world that the 3 sons of Musa ibn Shakir grew up. Their father had been a court astronomer and bandit, that combination is historically attested, who died while his sons were still young. The Caliph al-Mamun, reportedly impressed by the father's intellect, took the brothers into the palace and had them educated at the House of Wisdom. What followed was one of the most productive scientific careers of the medieval world. The brothers worked in astronomy, geometry, and mechanics. They funded translations of Greek mathematical texts, including works of Archimedes and Apollonius. They measured the circumference of the Earth using a method of their own design, producing a result accurate to within a few percent. But their most extraordinary legacy was a single manuscript. Around 850 AD, they completed the Kitab al-Hiyal, the Book of Ingenious Devices. It described 100 devices in precise engineering language, with diagrams, dimensions, and operating principles. It was not a book of magic tricks. It was a technical manual. The devices in the Book of Ingenious Devices fall into categories that read, to a modern eye, like a preview of engineering history. There are automatically refilling vessels that use float valves, the direct ancestor of the mechanism in every modern toilet system. There are fountain systems that change their jet patterns over time without human intervention, using internal chambers and timed water flows to produce variety. There is a flute that plays itself, driven by air pressure from a water-powered bellows, its notes controlled by a rotating cylinder with pegs. A programmable drum, in effect, a mechanism that encodes a sequence of actions and executes them in order. The historian of technology, Donald Hill, who produced the first major English translation of the text in 1979, describes several of the devices as containing genuine engineering novelty. Some show understanding of feedback control, the principle that a system can monitor its own state and adjust its behavior, that would not be formally described in Western engineering until the 18th century. The brothers were not just imitating Greek mechanics, they were extending and recombining principles in ways that had no clear precedent. Here is what most histories of science do not mention. When we trace the genealogy of mechanical invention in the popular story, from the Greeks to Leonardo to the Industrial Revolution, we are following a narrative that was partly constructed after the fact. The Arabic and Islamic contribution to that chain was systematically marginalized in European accounts from the Renaissance onward, not because the evidence was absent, but because the frameworks used to organize history made it inconvenient. Scholars knew about the Banu Musa by the 12th century. Latin translators in Toledo and Sicily were working from Arabic texts that built directly on the brothers' work. The chain of transmission was real and documented, but the names dropped out of the popular account, and the contributions were either attributed to the Greeks the brothers had translated, or simply left without origin. The Mongol sack of Baghdad in 1258 destroyed much of the House of Wisdom's physical collection. That catastrophe is real and devastating. But the erasure of the Banu Musa from popular science history is a different kind of loss, a slow editorial one made over centuries of selective telling. The manuscript itself survived. Copies exist in Istanbul, Oxford, and Cairo. Modern engineers at institutions including University College London have reconstructed several of the devices and confirmed they function as described. The self-regulating vessel works, the programmable flute works, the feedback float valve works. These are not theoretical curiosities. They are functional mechanisms that a 9th-century workshop in Baghdad built from brass and water and careful thought. When you hold that fact clearly, a programmable machine operating in 850 AD in a city whose intellectual culture was actively, deliberately cultivated by a state that understood the value of knowledge, the standard timeline of invention does not merely stretch, it breaks open. And the question that remains is not whether the Islamic Golden Age produced great science. It did. The question is why it took the rest of the world so long to say so plainly, and what else we might be missing by telling the story too simply. The Book of Ingenious Devices described not just what could be built, but a method. Observe, measure, describe, test. That is the structure of the scientific method, centuries before it acquired its European name. The brothers also wrote on the measurement of plane and spherical figures, extending Archimedean geometry in ways that later influenced European mathematicians directly. Their work on conic sections reached European universities through Latin translations made in the 12th century. The most striking thing about the Banu Musa's legacy is not its sophistication, it is the ordinariness with which they treated that sophistication. These devices were not wonders displayed in a palace to impress a caliph. They were working tools in a culture that had normalized engineering ambition. That cultural context, a state that funded science, a city that rewarded curiosity, a tradition that built on rather than discarded what came before, is what the standard account leaves out. The House of Wisdom was not an accident. It was a policy, a deliberate investment in the idea that gathered knowledge compounds. The Abbasid caliphs paid translators by the weight of finished manuscript. That is an incentive structure, not a coincidence. The Banu Musa brothers understood they were part of something larger than their own work. They personally funded the translation of Greek works they knew would outlast them. That act of intellectual stewardship, funding the preservation of knowledge for future generations, is itself a form of engineering. The devices described in the Book of Ingenious Devices did not emerge from nowhere. They emerged from 2 generations of state-funded translation that made the entire world's accumulated technical knowledge available in a single language. Arabic became, for a century, what the Internet became in the 20th century, a common infrastructure that let ideas from everywhere meet and combine. It is a lesson in what civilizations can do when they decide that knowing things matters. The Banu Musa brothers lived remarkable lives by any measure. They were orphaned young, raised by a caliph, educated at the finest institution in the world, and produced work that engineers can still build and run today. The brass vessel that poured itself in 850 AD is still their clearest monument, not because it is complex. By modern standards, it is simple, but because it represents a mind that looked at a problem. How do you keep a vessel full without constant human attention, and solved it with precision and care? That is what we nearly lost. Not the object, but the example, that a society organized around the value of knowledge can compress centuries of progress into a single generation. The vessel poured itself, and no one who witnessed it thought it magic, because in Baghdad, In the 9th century, that was simply what careful thinking looked like.